welcome to The Big Picture with Arturo Parker. Today in this first episode, I wanted to provide outlines for the theory that I would offer as a replacement to economic theory as it is currently taught in our textbooks, if it were up to me. There's a lot to be said about what's wrong with economic theory. You could fill libraries with just this topic. One of the books I've most enjoyed, which discusses this, is called Cogs and Monsters by Diane Coyle. There are a number of books that just focus on a particular segment of the theory that are thought to be wrong, like Misbehaving by Richard Thaler. Then there's the complex systems approach and critique. W. Brian Arthur is one of the main proponents of that. So you could spend all day, you could spend a whole bunch of videos just talking about what's wrong with economic theory. But from a very, very high level, these maps beside me provide a useful metaphor for what's going wrong. Lower down, I have a typical classroom map. And these typical classroom maps are highly warped. And they're actually warped in such a way so as to make the northern hemisphere look larger, which makes perfect sense because the world's superpowers in the last several hundred years have been northern countries, namely the United States, and before that, Great Britain. So it makes sense that the maps that they would distribute would tend to show an image of the world which was warped in such a way to exaggerate their own size and importance, right? So this is a typical classroom map, and it's wrong, and it's warped in a way which favors the most powerful entities on the map. In contrast, above this typical classroom map, I have what's called an orthographic map, and this orthographic map shows the world's continents in a more accurate proportion, each to the others. And if somebody who was presented all their lives with a warped map, which is the standard map, was to be shown an orthographic map, an accurate corrected map, they would think that the corrected map was warped. This is one of the reasons that this forms a large part of the backdrop for this show. It's a natural metaphor to remind people that when we grow up on warped information sources, our perspective of reality becomes warped, and it becomes so warped that accurate information starts to sound warped. So, coming back to the question, what's wrong with economic theory? Well, economic theory favors the most powerful. I'm going to pull a quote from, this was I believe he was a 2015 or 2016 recipient of the Nobel Prize by the name of Angus Deaton. And he wrote, "So much of its conventional wisdom and its traditional textbook material is weighted towards capital and against labor." Again, this is a Nobel recipient. He's saying the textbooks are weighted towards the perspective of capital, which tends to be more powerful and influential, and away from the perspectives of labor. I'm just going to leave my discussion of what's wrong with economics at that. It's warped, and it's warped in a way that favors the most powerful. Just like the entire picture of history, it said that history is taught from the perspective of the winners. Well, that's not just true about history. That also reaches into other subjects. But coming back to what would I do to replace economics as it is taught? That brings me to the subject of today's video, which is what I refer to as Feudal Attractor Theory, or the theory of the great feudal attractor. So currently, the idea at the heart of economics textbooks is equilibrium. And my approach takes a slightly different idea, which I'm importing from dynamical systems theory, something called an attractor state. And an attractor state is very similar in some ways to the idea of equilibrium, whereas equilibrium refers to the equilibrium of a particular market. The idea that I am suggesting should hold the center of economic theory, this idea of attractor states, is sort of like equilibrium for a system, the solution for a system. An attractor state is defined as a state or set of states towards which a system tends to evolve from within a range of initial conditions. And that range of conditions is called a neighborhood. Now, I'm actually not the first person to advance this hypothesis that feudalism or something like feudalism is the attractor state for large human groups. The first person to expound on this hypothesis is the American astrophysicist David Brin, and I'll cut to him real quick.
There are attractor states in human society that either will foil us or help us. The biggest attractor state across the last 6,000 to 10,000 years has been feudalism. I'm not talking about the strict definition of feudalism, lords and fealty oaths and all that sort of thing. I'm talking about the generic thing that it represents, which is a pyramidal society. But I also think that the attractor state of feudalism or inheritance-based oligarchy is one that governs very badly. You get this horrible, horrible story called human history, filled with horrible errors, because criticism, which is the error correction process, was squelched by these lords and kings and priests. The history is rife with them just crushing anybody who would criticize them.
This idea came to me in 2021 when I first learned about the idea of attractors or attractor states. And I thought to myself, well, if an attractor is sort of a system solution, it's the state towards which a system evolves. Well, feudalism fits that description. Because in every human society that we know of, historically speaking, there's been this pattern for that society to self-organize towards this pyramidic, feudal system of organization and wealth distribution. There's always a king at the top. You can change the name, but there's this person at the top. There are nobles or an aristocracy below them, the oligarchs. Below them, there are various, iterations of vassals and fiefs and serfs. If you go and look at feudal Japan, medieval Japan, the names were different. All right, there were daimyos or there was shoguns, but the deep structural characteristics of this configuration for a human society were the same. Similar story when Europeans first found the Mayans. It was the same story. It was this like feudal system of organization. In my approach, I actually haven't been able to find that much that David Brin says about his conception of a feudal attractor state. In my view, I think he's left a lot of meat on the bone for me, so to speak, even though I'm vegan. The way that I've approached this is breaking down the evolution of society along a number of different dimensions. I first start with the evolution of wealth distribution. In fact, this is one of the most empirically best supported patterns in the history of economic science. It's the idea that the wealth distribution is always the same shape, no matter whether you're looking at Maasai tribes where the wealth is measured in cattle, or you're looking at a modern capitalist, financialized economy like the United States, where most wealth is measured in the form of shares of companies. No matter what the underlying currency is or forms of wealth, the distribution of that wealth always follows what is now known as a Pareto distribution, or also same thing, different name for it, a power law distribution. Always. And so I think of this as the fundamental attractor. This is the first attractor that sets in motion all the other attractor states, right? This is the heart of the feudal attractor. There's no way that a wealth distribution can remain egalitarian for any given human group. If ever there are two competing oligarchs, one of them is always going to come up on top. There's actually a Chinese idiom about this. It says, "Yishan burong erhu," a mountain cannot fit two tigers. They're going to fight. They're going to compete. One of them's going to come out on top. One of them's going to end up becoming, the top dog, by far the most wealthy or the most powerful figure for that mountain, for that political entity, that group, that area. So first dimension is the wealth distribution. And Thomas Piketty writes about this extensively. He's one of the people who's influenced my thinking most, as well as convinced me of the need for a replacement for economic theory. But he has shown and developed ideas and theories about why this might be, but he's shown that in all areas of the world, wealth concentration has shown this tendency to increase. And there's also these agent-based models. I read about one of these agent-based models in a book called The Origin of Wealth Behind Me by Eric Beinhocker, where he showed that the model was called Sugarscape. And it was a very simple, computerized, economy where all these miners were looking for sugar. And they walked around in a checkerboard landscape trying to mine sugar. And it might start out with a relatively equal income distribution, but you hit play on the game, and as time passes, the wealth distribution evolves towards oligarchic domination of wealth. Okay. Now, the other dimensions that I pay a lot of attention to and look into are the institutional evolution of society. And the institutional evolutions of society has its own attractor state. In my writing, I say institutions, or the institutional configuration for human societies, it tends to evolve towards oligarchic capture, where the vast majority of the rules and regulations become captured by the oligarchs who set those rules in accordance with their interests, which actually tends to exacerbate the tendency of the widening gap. Another dimension I look at is the evolution of the media landscape. And again, this media landscape evolves towards oligarchic capture. And this is an example of an area where you can really just look at the world right now to check your work and say, oh, yeah, it would seem that way, because the US or the Western media landscape, certainly the US media landscape, but I think this is true for virtually any country where you want to look at it, it's been captured by oligarchs. Something like 6 corporations control about 90% of what Americans see. And when it comes to the major news channels or news organs, paper news, the New York Times is controlled by the Salisbury family. and there's a few other investors. The Washington Post, controlled by Jeff Bezos, an oligarch. The Wall Street Journal, owned and controlled by the Murdoch family, Rupert Murdoch, Australian billionaire and oligarch. And you go down the line, Murdoch also controls Fox News. X, now owned by Elon Musk. So this is one of the areas where I think it'd be hard to contest the theory as I present it. And it's also one of the areas of my theory that sort of confirms this general rule that I'm suggesting here with the maps, which is to say, if the media is captured by oligarchs, well, their use of the media will tend to promote a warped image of the world, just like we find with typical classroom maps. One of the ways in which my proposed approach to economics is starkly different from a typical economics textbook is that a typical macroeconomics textbook takes the nation as the largest unit of analysis. And that should set off alarm bells in everybody's head, because the nation is not the scale at which economic activity takes place. Economic activity takes place internationally. The economic system is an international system. So I think that macroeconomics should be analyzing an international picture. Another difference between my approach and sort of the accepted orthodox textbook approach to economics is that my approach is fundamentally interdisciplinary. I think you also have to bring into your analysis linguistics, ideology, religion. Religion, by the way, follows a similar rule to what I've been talking about. The attractor state for religious evolution. Religions also tend to evolve towards oligarchic capture. This will come as a surprise to some Christians out there who are watching, but the version of Christianity that you practice is just the version that the Holy Roman Empire selected among a number of different strands of Christianity during the Nicene event, 323. It was in 380, between 380 and 384, under the Holy Roman Empire, that this version of Christianity became, by law, the only type of Christianity that you could practice. Anything else would be considered heretical and would be actively prosecuted by the state. Similarly, if you want to look at the evolution of Buddhism, you can look at 845, one of the four great Buddhist persecutions. I think this is the third great Buddhist persecution in the year 845. Emperor, I want to say Wu Zong, essentially selected for a particular strand of Buddhism, which better matched or was in closer accordance with what he wanted to teach the population. And he actively destroyed thousands of monasteries and decreed that 260,000 or so monks and nuns had to return back to lay life. So there are these major events in the history of religious evolution that select for a version of a religious doctrine which accords with the ideals and desires of the most powerful. So this rule that what survives over time is specifically those ideas, those ideologies, those religions, those media structures, the infrastructural setup of society, the institutional setup of society, no matter what dimension you want to look at. There's certain elements that get destroyed, eliminated, deleted, left behind. And there's certain elements of the configuration that are promoted and protected, the ones that are favored by oligarchs. And this is sort of the one of the central laws to the approach to economics that I promote. And I refer to it as North's Law. And I'm quoting Douglas North. He's a 1990 recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics. He said, institutions are not necessarily or even usually created to be socially efficient. Rather, they, or at least the formal rules, are created to serve the interests of those with the bargaining power to devise new rules. So, what I would teach in an economic textbook is I would teach that every human civilization in history has tended to evolve towards this feudal system, and that we are also part of history, and that it's happening now. And that the central challenge of economics is resisting that process of falling into this attractor state and learning how to instead develop institutions that don't just serve the most powerful, the plutocrats, the oligarchs, but instead to reconfigure the world, to reconfigure the distribution of wealth, to reconfigure the media, to reconfigure the institutional configuration, the infrastructural configuration of society, the linguistic configuration of society, our inherited language, the way we talk about the world, towards configuration which advances the interests of the populace. I doubt that will ever be taught in official economics textbooks, but at least I can start to provide and discuss an alternative here. Now, I've been at this for a number of years. There's no way I'm going to be able to cram a thorough introduction to feudal attractor theory into just a 30-minute conversation with you, but at least this can serve as an introduction to what I refer to as feudal attractor theory and how I imagine it might take the place of the warped picture of reality that we inherit in the standard commonly assigned texts. Thank you for watching. My name is Arturo Parker, and this is The Big Picture. I'll see you in the next episode.